Outstanding. Well, we are going to get started. We have a large number of attendees, participants, and registrants today, so we're so glad that you could join us. My name is Spencer Giese. I'm a research educational specialist at ACUHO, and I'm thrilled that you're joining us for week 11 of our virtual roundtable series. Today is another installment of our Senior Housing Officer virtual roundtables. Today, we have both the opportunity for an open forum, but we're also going to do some dedicated discussion around the ability to partner and work with other institutions in your geographic area to collaborate to solve potential COVID-19 issues that you may be facing. So working together in the field and in your geographic areas to help some of your problems. This week's virtual roundtables have been brought to you in partnership with ACUHO and Parcel Pending by Quadient. So we thank Quadient for their partnership on these virtual roundtables. This is our third of 4 this week. We do have a Women in Housing Network session tomorrow afternoon as well. So if you are interested and you've not signed up yet, please go to our website and sign up for that session. It's going to be a great one. As always, we have a variety of resources for you to check out on our ACUHO platforms. We have a YouTube channel dedicated to our virtual roundtable recordings. We are now hitting 40 on our virtual roundtable recordings, so that's very exciting. Lots of great content for you to digest. We have our always vibrant online community that has threads that are COVID-19 dedicated, as well as threads of typical questions you may be seeing this time of year, where people in the field are able to connect with one another and help solve those issues. And then we have a resource page dedicated to COVID-19 solutions. And really, I'd like to thank you on behalf of ACUHO for being members of ACUHO. Those membership dollars are what directly fund our ability to do these types of outreaches. So let's talk about our session for today. Many of you know this is a conversation based. This is not a webinar. This is an opportunity to have questions asked, answered. You're able to connect with others in this session as well as our panelists. We ask that you use the Q&A function to submit questions that you may have today. You have the ability on the Q&A function to see all the questions that are being posed, and you can upvote topics that you want to make sure get answered. So please like and upvote those questions if you see a good one there. Put your name, institution, position on there just so we can better connect with you and so that other attendees of the session can connect with you. And you never know, we might ask you to ask that question live on our roundtable today. Just to make sure that everything's working properly, you should be seeing a slide about questions and comments. Hopefully you're hearing me loud and clear. If both those things are true for you, if you could just hit the raised hand function, make sure those raised hand functions work. Excellent. And that shows me that we've got a lot of engaged attendees today. So thank you so much for that. Later on, you may raise your hand when we're speaking about a topic, and that's our signal that you really want to chime in on that. So please be aware if you use that raised hand function, you just might get called on back in just like it's 5th grade again. So please use that raised hand function if you'd like to chime in. I'm joined by 4 outstanding speakers today. And I'm certainly going to pass it over to them and start to hear about what their experience on campus is, their reactions to some of the topics we have today. But first, if they could all introduce themselves and share with us just kind of what's been going on your campus this week. We realize that this COVID-19 world on campuses, things move fast. So where are we at on campus this week? And one note I would just share before we dive into our introductions. As you notice, our speakers today are from 3 institutions that are all Washington, D.C. based, and these institutions are actually just within a few miles of one another, and they've got some great resources they can share with us in terms of how they're able to collaborate and work together to both solve similar issues and just come together to solve problems together. So, Dr. Chris Silva, I'm going to have you start this off. Just kind of share what this week's been like for you on campus.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you everyone for tuning in to the roundtable. I think this week, this partial week, right, with the holiday, has been one where I think we're we're much more talking about concrete elements of the fall semester, in the sense of, okay, I think we have an exact plan, or we're close to one, how we're going to be enacting that, especially as it relates to capacity of buildings. I think the last couple of weeks have provided some good amount of information in terms of where incoming students and families may be thinking about. And I wasn't expecting that us to come into this week and be in a mode where we're looking for an extra number of beds off campus right now, and that we're trying to perhaps secure those spaces already at a certain volume, because I really have been thinking that the melt and the number of students that may not be coming to campus, but it seems like that may be turning a corner, and that may not be the case, that we still would need a large number of spaces for students this coming fall. So I think in terms of things are getting more solid, more concrete about fall semester, it seems like this week.
Thanks, Chris. Let's go over to Lisa.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in our country and world. My name is Lisa Freeman. I'm the Director of Residence Life at American University, and Chris is my kind of co-colleague that works to provide a unique housing and residence life experience. What happens for me this week has been interesting. We've been spending a good amount of time talking about the student experience and knowing some of the challenges, some of the adjustments that we're going to have to make and adapt to ensure that we can provide the best possible student experience. So we've been talking through what that looks like, both for our student staff members, our leaders that will be working with our residential students, but also in thinking about our preparations for our orientation. So, we normally will meet with students and families and talk about what the on-campus experiences look like. And we're having to have significant modifications to how we're talking about the on-campus experience for families, and making sure that we're maintaining a high level of engagement opportunities for students in light of COVID-19. Additionally, Chris and I have been working on thinking about, we're really having to assess our entire operations. Many of us have been in this field for some time, and we can do most of what we do with our eyes closed, and now we're having to rethink everything. So we are working almost page to page, looking at our operation and give consideration to where we have to make modifications, knowing that many of us will still be working in a hybrid model. We won't all be on campus at the same time. And so how do we continue to move our operations forward, knowing that we have to make some adjustments? And that's going to be somewhat challenging and somewhat tricky for those of us that have worked in this field, but then also in students who are expecting to be a bit more engaged, as would be a traditional college campus.
Thank you, Lisa. And let's turn it over to Seth.
Hi there, I'm Seth Weinschel, Assistant Dean of Students at George Washington University. Just so everybody is aware of our location, we are about 2 blocks from the White House. Stephanie is about a couple of miles west of us, and Lisa is Lisa and Chris are a few miles north of us. Our week, we've gotten to a cadence of meetings around sort of reopening for the fall, where essentially Monday, Wednesday, Thursdays, and Fridays, we have an 8:30 meeting, looking at planning and making decisions and creating problem statements that need answers and resources. And I am co-chairing the space group, which has 22 members on it, which is fun in and of itself, with 22 members. But for the past couple of weeks, we've been making assumptions and putting things on paper. And yesterday, we actually went and tested those assumptions and toured just a few of our spaces. And frankly, what we found was that some of our assumptions were wrong. The amount of space that you need to create in classrooms when you actually look at, putting chairs 6 feet apart, takes some of our rooms that typically would have 60 people to like 14. And so starting to look at some of those things, and that is what we are spending a whole lot of time looking at, is how do we operationalize social distancing in our space? What are the things we need to do to modify? And then how do we make sure that if and when we open for the fall, that it is safe and that our students are well communicated with, our staff is well communicated with, our faculty is well communicated with, and then how do you actually enforce some of the things that we're going to set up as expectations for our community?
Thanks, Seth. And Stephanie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephanie, and I come from Georgetown University, as Chris said, or not Chris, Seth. We're just a couple miles away from him and also from Chris and Lisa. So I am very blessed to have these colleagues with me. I will also just want to take a quick moment to thank all of you, that I know it's incredibly difficult right now to be in these very challenging times. And it's very important to have leaders like all of you being able to guide the way for your staff and for your institutions. And so I just wanted to start off that moment by saying thank you. We are in very similar circumstances, so I think I'll add on to a few other things that we've been talking about. So one, we're also in the middle of our summer project work. So we did a bond last year, so we have some money that is different from all the other financial issues that just like all of you are working through. But we're also taking advantage of the fact that we have most of our residence halls empty for the summer. So we are going to be doing a significant amount of work in our spaces in 10 weeks that just got approved today. So we're also navigating that. It's a blessing that it will happen. And at the same time, we're also trying to think about how does that impact our move-in, for example, in the fall, when we don't have some spaces that might be ready in time for a staged early arrival. A few other things that I would also talk about, and we can get into the details in a moment when we're talking about fall planning, but I felt like we definitely shifted from graduation, and I think we took a little bit of a break going into Memorial Day weekend, and now we've really started to pick up on the fall planning scenarios, in particular for housing and unwrapping some of the layers that happen with that, which include many of the things that my friends had mentioned, but also the idea that we're talking about how do we do financial aid and the cost of attendance, how much are we charging students this year, when can we do our housing assignments? We left campus before we housed any students or had our students leave, so we've postponed our housing selection twice. And we've got another group that is also thinking about move-in and who's going to be on campus. That's a big question for us. And everybody has a different thought about how many students and when they can come. And so there has been, as everyone has mentioned, lots of scenario planning, and I will own that I am somewhat Zoom fatigued and decision-making fatigued. And yesterday I thought it was really great that I was able to do the dishes at one point yesterday. So trying to take those little wins where I can, and also just trying to make sure that we have good information, and we'll get into it later, but how do we continue to manage up and manage across and with our colleagues in general.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you to all of our speakers for both sharing and for being with us today. And I would echo Stephanie's statement. Thank you, attendees, for being here. We've got a lot of great perspectives. We already have a lively Q&A. I'd love to see all these questions coming through, and many of you who are here attending being able to share resources and share viewpoints with other members. So thank you so much for that. I hope to see that stay lively over the session. We've got about 4 topics we want to cover that are pointed topics, and then we're going to open it up for all the Q&As that are coming in, any of those that don't relate to these topics. The first topic that we are going to have the panel speak on is kind of fall planning, where they're at in that process, what that looks like as of right now. And I will allow any panelist to jump in and start the topic.
So if you all don't mind, I'm going to take a crack at this one first. So our president a couple of months, probably in early April, said we will make a decision roughly June 15th. And so about, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks ago now, a massive university committee, you can all understand how quickly those work, massive institutional committee was brought together to sort of provide the president with guidance as to sort of how do we open safely and what are the things we have to do. I mentioned I am co-chair of one of the subcommittees that has 22 people. So I think there are like 100 to 150 people on this committee, all with subgroups. And then we're actually going to end up with other subgroups that have come out of it. But the pace we have been at has been at a minimum of 3 set meetings a week with sort of off subcommittee meetings to actually do some of the work that each of the groups has to do. And so what we are doing and what we have done is we have tried to simplify, I say simplify in a really complex problem, every single thing that we can think about. So I think right now we have 300 problem statements, and every single one of them has 5 or 6 solutions. And what we are then doing is putting together, based on those solutions, what are must-dos, what are should-dos, what are could-dos or could-dos and should-dos, and then starting to run numbers on sort of the cost of those. And the group is determining what are good ideas and what are necessarily not good ideas, and starting to weed out some of those. And one example, I saw a question of, are we providing PPE to all of our students as a question? That is one of our problem statements, right? The issue is people need to have PPE, but then who is providing it? And so for us, I think it's going to be a combination of we provide some and students provide some. But so that is some of the stuff that we're doing. And then we're testing assumptions. So yesterday we walked space, and I highly recommend to go out and view your campus through a new lens, because it opens up a lot of interesting dilemmas around loading, stairwells, hallways, all the things that we know have been coming up, but things that you then have to think about for solutions in order to keep things safe. And the hope is that we're going to provide a report, and we will be able to say this is not insurmountable to open, and we will be opening in the fall. But we're providing the information to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah, and I think what I could add on to some of this too is, one of the things you'll probably hear is we're talking a little bit about just being in the same city. We also have some very similar dynamics in terms of DC is asking all the colleges and universities to submit their plans for approval. I believe it's this Friday, we're opening into stage 1 for DC. So that certainly plays a part in what we're doing. I would also say that Georgetown is both a very consensus building place and also risk adverse. And so those two things I do think play into some of the conversations that we are having. I would also say where I think we're starting to land, and this is still to be determined and approved, my sense is if we were to open today or to make a decision about opening today, we would have 1 person per bedroom across our slate of different types of housing. So whether you are in a community bathroom area, a suite style, or an apartment, and we're still trying to figure out what the rates would look like for that. We have certainly put in a proposal that we would collapse our rates into probably more something like if you live in a residence hall versus a suite, a townhouse, or an apartment. Some of this is all to be determined. So I say this as part of our scenario and fall planning. Some of the other planning that we've also been doing, like I mentioned, is we had a group that started to get together, and because one of our key dates, which is helping us try to drive some of the decisions or have people give us some additional information, is on July 7th. We have to send out fall bills. We have pushed back the fall bill date from June 15th to July 7th because we're trying not to do work twice for many of our colleagues. So we have all of our new students got their financial aid package awards. None of our returning students have them yet, but all of the decisions around who's going to be on campus and how much we're charging plays very critically in what we're doing around fall planning. I will say one of the unique things for me in Washington, D.C. that we also deal with a lot, and I know some of my other colleagues on this call do as well, is we have very strong what we call ANCs, neighborhood commissions. And for us, I can see Chris's face and he's sort of chuckling, is that we have a very strong neighborhood. The neighborhood really sort of runs and drives some of our decisions. And we have about 1,000 seniors that live off campus in group homes. And so we're also having to do some fall planning scenario about, you know, I think some of the neighbors would want us to be able to move everybody out of the neighborhood or de-densify. So we're trying to navigate some of those questions as well. And I think we're going to be looking at a larger communications and education plan as we go forward and open up in the residence halls about like how much stuff should you bring? Because if we have to close quickly, we don't want to have to pack everything again or have you leave it here. And to also think about if we do go to a scenario where we go full occupancy in the spring, it means that you'll have to move at the end of the semester. So I think we're trying to think about how we can best navigate and sort of set up some expectations to begin with. In terms of the PPE question, we have provided information, a video on how to make one. We also, for our students who remained on campus for the spring, did a program where they could make one based on donated t-shirts that we got from athletics and student engagement. But we are not providing PPEs for anyone at this time, except for our staff who are on campus right now, who have to be on campus or because of the nature of their work, like custodial staff, facility staff, who we know are going into spaces where that might be required. And then I think the other piece on fall planning that I would just mention is that we're actually right now starting a straw proposal of looking at what are our dates for August transition and really starting to talk about summer ends for us on August 8th. We need students to start class by the last Wednesday in August. So how do we stage our move-in? How many people do we need to bring in? And that's going to help us drive decisions around what orientation would look like, our hundreds of students that come back for pre-orientation, and our athletes, especially if they're going to be in fall sports.
Thank you, Stephanie. And at American University, I think one aspect that we've also been doing, in addition to what some of the aspects that Seth talked about with campus-wide planning efforts, and what Stephanie talked about in terms of having a direction on single rooms, and we have worked on both understanding what is the campus-wide risk management planning, what are those key guidelines, what are those key elements, so that we can then take those elements and then work with our teams in Housing Residence Life to then plan what the execution of that work is. And so Lisa and I in our weekly housing leadership team meeting have been working on, okay, how do we take that and then break out into groups that will design what it will look like on the ground in the fall semester? What are those considerations? Because those staff members are the ones who will work and execute all this work. And so we have been very purposeful at bringing that guiding aspect from the campus-wide planning into to the office, and already encouraging and you know, giving the ownership to our colleagues, assistant directors, associate directors, and others to put a format and put whether that is already a process or that's a suggested process that's waiting on another piece of decision, another piece of guideline, but engaging them on that planning process, because we think that that's so critical that it doesn't just stay in a senior level of the university or senior level of the offices. So that is something all the way since when the initial incidents were happening, we've really made sure that our leadership teams were in charge and were developing those processes and planning those efforts so that they can be really well executed and that they feel part of that, they have ownership over those processes. So I would say in terms of planning, to add to what you mentioned, that has been really an important aspect for us. I think when we're thinking about campus-wide planning, one aspect that has been also important for us was staying aware of guidelines or suggestions or models from other campuses so that we can advise up on some of these models. And I think we're talking a little earlier with Seth about some of the policies and processes, but I think that has been helpful for us to know what those are and then inform up so that we're not perhaps limiting ourselves too much, but we're also exposing ourselves too much because many of our colleagues who are up on at the really high up level may not be aware of these small details or these pieces of information that we're learning from different associations like ACUHO, ACUHO, etc. So.
Great.
And
Thank
just to touch on what we're doing, because I think Stephanie and Chris both talked about in terms of sort of where they're thinking about how many people per room. At GW, we are not looking at essentially de-densifying much of our inventory. We still have some units that have bunk beds. We are looking at removing bunk beds, which for us removes about 100 to 150 beds from our inventory. But we are still looking at where we have doubles, we will have 2 people in those units. Where we have apartments, they will remain the same number of people assigned to apartments. But really sort of our guiding principles being sort of no more than sort of 2 to 4 people per actual unit and bathroom in terms of sharing that type of space.
Thanks, all. We're going to move to our next topic, one of our key topics we want to talk about today. And Chris, I really think through your role as the chair of the Future of Housing work group, I think this has really come up quite a bit with you, is this concept of collaborating across institutions. So I'll have you lead this off. If we could just talk about how your group in Washington, D.C. has really started to see that opportunity to collaborate.
Thank you, Spencer. And I actually would, I appreciate you initiating that. But I think one of the person who's brought us together officially keeps bringing us together is actually Stephanie, as she has, checked on us at different times and also put together a bi-weekly meeting that we have for us to collaborate. So I actually would pass it over to Stephanie, and she can get us started with a collaboration topic.
Well, thanks, Chris, and that's very sweet of you. And I would also say, I think Seth had a hand. I think we all had a role in it. And one of the things that's been really great, I know everybody's like, but one of the things that I think has been really great and what I appreciate about being in DC is that especially the people in these 3 institutions have for a number of years collaborated with each other. When things were happening back in February, we were texting each other like, well, what did you decide to do today? How are you doing this? And quite honestly have gotten a lot of great ideas from folks at AU, folks at GW. And I would also say a shout out to my Jesuit colleagues as well. There's a Jesuit housing network that's been meeting about every 3 to 4 weeks. And there have been some key leaders in that space. And I have other friends that I text with. But I think what's been really helpful is that we also know that our vice presidents are talking with each other, our presidents are talking with each other. I think, 2 quick ones is that I think Chris at one point texted me and he's like, so I hear our presidents are talking. What have you heard? And Seth the other day when we were on this conference call was just like, so I heard you're looking for 2,000 bed spaces off campus. Is that true? And I was like, well, you know more than I do at this point. Rather funny because sometimes people get Georgetown and GW mixed up. But I would just say I think it's been really helpful and important to be able to continue to make those connections because I imagine that we're going to end up making a decision at about the same time and in very close proximity with some nuances. And it's very helpful to feed information up, at least to my vice president, as we're talking about what the other institutions are doing.
I mean, I think one thing that came up, you know, we all belong to a consortium of schools in the sort of DC metro area. And one of the conversations that we sort of had, I don't even know, maybe a week ago, a week and a half, the weeks blend at this point, was what I'm referring to as the COVID hotel. And I keep wanting to offer people space in my COVID hotel. But from a collaboration standpoint, you know, I think one of the things that we all know we need is isolation and quarantine space. And so the conversation that we had was, you know, look, if I rent a hotel that's 250 units and I don't need 250 units, that's going to cost me millions of dollars. If I can share the cost of that with another institution, I may be able to lower my risk and my financial burden, which then also may allow us to actually get to, as Stephanie talks about, some of the decisions, right, may allow us to get to some of those decisions sooner because the numbers, right, I'm no longer looking at an $8 million property, I'm looking at a $2 or $3 million property, and that, because we're sharing it, becomes a very different conversation as we start to do some of the fall planning. And so, you know, what I would recommend to everybody is, you know, in thinking outside of the box of all the things that we can do, you're not just limited to your own institution and your own resources. Think about how you can share resources to maybe get some buying power through your consortiums, you know, as options. You know, because certainly that may allow for some very different decision making.
The only other thing that I'll add is in my role in working with the RA team and live-in staff, it's been really, really helpful to have close contact with institutions that are in similar proximities. And I say that because, you know, once a decision's made, you know, folks talk, they share information, and it's critically important for us to both learn from our colleagues and kind of how they arrived at decisions, but also to share kind of perspectives and how those perspectives might create some modifications to decisions. And so I say that when we were transitioning students off campus in the spring, I believe we may have done so before a couple of our colleagues, and being able to walk through kind of how we arrived at decisions. Did RAs stay? Were RAs released? Did you compensate your RAs for the entire portion of the semester, or did you, you know, change the compensation structure? Being able to collaborate with a certain level of immediacy was critical in providing the support that was needed. And I think the same will also be true in the planning for the fall semester. So, you know, I saw a couple of questions around like the RAs and, you know, what modifications that we might be making, both in terms of the job description and the training. When you think about being able to collaborate with folks that are in close proximity, that's going to be extremely, extremely important. We have similar type students that come to our institution. We also have similar type RAs. So we all manage very similar flare-ups that occur. And so I think what we've done a really good job at is giving each other the kind of heads up, this is coming, or hey, I'm managing this and here's how I managed it. I think has been extremely helpful and has been in some ways a safety net, knowing that you've got colleagues that are in close proximity that are feeling it the way you feel it and are navigating it also in a similar fashion.
I will say one of the things, just to piggyback on what Lisa was saying, that I really appreciate is when I come after those, like after those calls are done, sort of the idea of, okay, we're on the right track, or, oh, I didn't even begin to think about this. Like the last conversation we had I believe it was Seth that had brought up the idea of the housing occupancy agreements and how do we need to adjust some of the dates or maybe the rates. We had done some adjustments already just around what I'm going to call COVID language in terms of you're coming into spaces, you have a higher risk, but just to even be able to think about some of those things that you're not thinking about, I think has been really extremely helpful. And to Lisa's point, especially with our student staff, and we'll hear things like, well, are your RAs going to be doing that? And you're like, no, absolutely not. Or have you thought about this? And so it's been really helpful, and I really appreciate those partnerships. So whoever it is, if you don't have a colleague that's within your town per se, to find a network somewhere that can help bounce ideas off, I think is extremely important.
And I was going to also note something right in about probably four to 5 weeks ago, when we were starting to do some of the work with Future of Housing Work Group. I was actually reaching out to some colleagues in China, Singapore, and Australia because they had been exposed to COVID-19 much earlier than we did. And so it was interesting to hear from colleagues that were a little bit ahead about their perspective. So Stephanie, what you were saying about, if it's not in your close proximity, where are colleagues in other places? And also, I think, ACUHO is not just the US and in the United States. And there's so much learning from other countries, especially as colleagues that have already experienced it a little earlier in the year. So it was, I think I'm really appreciative to those colleagues that shared a lot to me in the beginning. So.
Great, thanks, Al. The next topic we had identified to talk about as a group was isolation and quarantine spaces. So I think, we can talk a little bit more about kind of what Seth had dug into in terms of finding ways to share those space reservations, but also what are your approaches to these spaces on campus right now? If we take a look at the Q&A section, there's certainly a number of questions around what's being done on these spaces. So I will open up to the group.
So given that I really want a COVID hotel just so that we can name it a COVID hotel, what we've sort of identified in terms of isolation and quarantine spaces is essentially a private unit with bathroom, most likely kitchen, that somebody will be able to be self-sufficient in for roughly 14 days. That is what we have been looking for and working to identify. Where we are probably landing is we are somewhere between 3 and 6% of our overall inventory in terms of, how much space we actually need in order to do that. So for us, we have 6,800 beds. We'll probably have about probably like 6,700 based on reducing some density. And so for us, it's that amount. But one of the things that we've also been talking about is at what point are we not moving somebody to an isolation or quarantine space and we are quarantining an entire building? And our public health experts, we have said we need that number because part of our planning is for some of our buildings, if 5 people test positive in that building, and that means we're quarantining that building, then the chances are we are not going to ever move anybody out of that space based on the number of people in that building that are going to end up testing positive as COVID-19 grows and hits campuses. And so that is, that has been some of our approach to isolation and quarantine spaces. And then we are really looking at, how do you provide food to folks, right? We're looking at 7 and 14-day meal kits. I refer to it as like Pringles and Pop-Tarts, but I think it's more than that. Where students will be able to be self-sufficient. And then we are also looking at contracting with a home health aid company to provide resources and medical resources to students in our COVID hotel so that it is not our staff dealing with that.
So I would say we're doing some things maybe a little bit different. So I think a few things to know specifically about Georgetown is, one, we have a hospital on campus. And we also have our own hotel on campus. And I think that those are two pieces, especially the hotel piece, that I think really adds some flexibility that we may not have otherwise. And I am also happy to share any resources that I have, materials. Just send me an email address. It's just my first name dot last name, stephanie.lynch@georgetown.edu. I'm happy to share it. Back in February, we actually had a few students that we needed to do isolation. And so we had a very extensive process where we walked through with our emergency management office, our auxiliary business services that does dining, and also with our healthcare professionals, so that they knew where the spaces were. They knew what we needed to outfit them with. We had a whole list of all the supplies that we needed. We set up, and I say we collectively, as it was certainly a joint process. We had maps to locate the spaces. We gave our health services a golf cart so that they could transport students themselves down to those quarantine spaces. We made sure keys were provided at the police department because we were also trying to minimize the amount of people who had to have contact with a person who was under investigation. I will say that, and we also had thermometers in there and other sort of first aid supplies. And our auxiliary business services, they were great partners in that students are able to select from a menu about what they would want. And so we also checked in where, our counseling center and our residence life staff would do phone check-ins to see how they were. I think that's evolving as we move into the fall a little bit. I think the idea around, if you have at least your own bathroom, if we were going to put you in the hotel anyway, like our own little mini COVID hotel, if you're by yourself and you have at least access to your own private bathroom, or if you're sharing an apartment with someone where you have a kitchen, should we just allow you to stay where you are? Because chances are, if you're in an apartment and you're in one bedroom and the other person's in another bedroom, that person is also going to have to be a person of investigation that will be under a quarantine for 14 days as well. So those are some of the pieces that we are trying to navigate. I think at the moment, with the hotel, it's probably at least 100 people. I don't think we're going to put space aside in the residence halls. How we're getting to that particular number is really with our healthcare professionals that have really been leading a lot of the efforts with the primary purpose, the safety and well-being of our staff and our students. But this is primarily for the undergraduates that live on campus and not for faculty or staff or other students. I just wanted to comment really quickly on the testing piece, because I think it's a great question and we don't have any final answers on the testing piece. We have started looking at our athletic department because they're also working on what testing would look like for athletes. There's another group that's looking at testing staff, but then there's also some pieces around what we have found from healthcare places in terms of, if you're going to work, what are the things that, is there a questionnaire that you, for example, have to fill out? My cousin works at a hospital, and before she goes into healthcare for that day, she has to fill out this particular survey that basically says, like, do you have a sore throat? Do you have a fever? And any one of those things could potentially then make sure that that person stays home. So we don't have final answers on that yet, but we are starting to talk about that as well.
Great. Thanks for sharing about that topic. I want to be mindful of time and also the amount of questions that we have in our Q&A. So we are going to jump to open forum. Panelists, we're going to try to do this in a rapid fire-esque fashion where if we've got one or two viewpoints where we can chime in, we're going to jump in and share that with the group. And also, again, thanks to the audience for chiming in on questions as you see them come in. Our number one upvoted question is from Michelle at Saginaw Valley State. Essentially, what new topics are being added to RA training to better serve students as we look toward fall? And just a shameless plug, some shame in this plug, next Thursday, actually, we're going to have a virtual roundtable on staff training, and we're hoping to touch on topics such as these. So feel free to register for that. We'll be sending out a mailing tomorrow to register for next week's sessions, but that is coming soon. But if any of our panelists had topics they've already planned on discussing with their staffs for the fall, feel free to jump in.
Sure, I'll just quickly say two areas that we are focused on. Our university is creating kind of a reacclimating back to campus for both faculty, students, and staff. So every community member will have to take this test or be trained. And so we are going to add a layer of that for our RAs as well, that they will have to think about the health and safety factors that would be part of their job and how to navigate that, particularly when you are dealing with a student that's in distress, or if there's an emergency incident that you maybe need some form of response. We're looking at what response would look like. We also are opening kind of our training, talking about, we're going to spend a half day talking about what virtual engagement looks like and how do you keep people engaged, knowing that there's the potential for fatigue. Students are just coming off an academic semester where they're having to do class after class. So how do you keep your community, how do you build community around virtual engagement? How do you keep people connected in virtual engagement? So we're focusing on that. And then the last thing that we also are doing is we're looking at copyright in digital space. Because there is a high propensity for folks to be violating copyright law, knowing that they're, wanting to do like screenings of movies and sharing music and things of that nature. So we're doing a whole session and a half devoted to educating our student leaders on digital space and how to engage in a way that doesn't create any violations of the actual law.
Thanks, Lisa. Excellent things to share there. Another question we have quite a few votes on, and we also have a lot of audience participation on this one, is David from Northern Kentucky. Basically, and a topic we've talked about quite a bit here in terms of if there's a reduced capacity in the fall, how is that trickling down to affect previously hired RAs? Are we letting RAs go? Are we compensating them anyway? Are they on a wait list and then they can join the staff when we're back at full occupancy? What are you seeing on your campus when it comes to RA staffing in reduced capacity situations?
Yeah, I can just quickly say at the moment, we have been told that even if we open up with, let's say, 2,900 students as opposed to 5,400, we're going to keep the full complement of our RA staff. And I really want to appreciate my VP who really advocated for that, knowing that we were going to have students that are probably coming back. I think to Lisa's earlier point about having to reacclimate, we're going to have a lot more mental health. And with a reduced area, we may need to rely on the RAs to do a lot more of the either programming or just really checking in with students on a mental health function.
And we are in a similar situation. Our VP is really advocating for us to keep all of our student leaders. One thing we have to take in consideration is an RA that had pre-COVID 50 residents, even with 25 residents, because of the modifications to occupancy, is going to feel like 50. And so we have to be able to advocate and adapt for continuing with the same staff structure, knowing that the needs of the residents are not going to change, even though the occupancy might be reduced.
Great, thank you for sharing that. A big question we also have seen a lot of comments on, and we can, if we're not there yet, totally understand. If you are planning so far ahead in the fall that you've already gotten to the concept of testing. So are you testing students before they move into the residence halls? If you are testing them, what is the methodology behind that? Any of our panelists there yet? I see smiles. Oh, Seth is unmuted. It's party time.
Yeah, I'll unmute. We are most likely going to require, we are going to require that students prove that they have been tested, and if they have not been tested, where they are coming from, then we will test them when they get here. And then we are also, I'm going to say 90% sure we are going to also require flu vaccinations for this year as well.
Thanks for that perspective. Community bathroom ratios. What are you all using for community bathroom ratios if you're at that point right now?
It's a great question, and probably the most asked question I think that we all have, and we wish we had an exact answer for it. At American, we're going to be using a ratio of 4 students per fixture. So if in a community bathroom, if we have 3 showers or 3 sinks and 3 toilets, we would use, we would have 4 students per one of those sets of fixtures. And so that's the standard that we're using. there's not a technical basis to that, or a document that we can refer to. There is a best case because in other buildings that we have, in our apartment buildings, we have 4 students sharing one bathroom. So we're following that standard across our buildings.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Another topic we want to touch on is, we talked a lot about isolation spaces. Is there a percentage that you're holding in your campus? So basically a percentage or a number of rooms per students, any number that you've used a formula for. I know it's similar to the bathroom. We're all wondering what's that magic formula.
So in providing guidance to my leadership, we looked at a number of things. We looked at the largest size building we had, and how many units are in there, and what that would look like, as well as looking at a percentage. So as I mentioned, we are probably within a 3 to 6%, because to Stephanie's point, if somebody's in a single, you don't have to move them anywhere, right? So you really have to start to slice and dice your inventory in order to come up with what the right number is for you in terms of what you feel comfortable with. As I've talked to colleagues, and I think on the first call, the number ranged from 18 to 140 units on the first call that Spencer hosted weeks ago. And so once that number was thrown out, we started to sort of figure out, okay, are we in the ballpark there?
We are using, at this moment, our plan is to use one of our smaller residence halls where students have their own bathroom. So it's a room and a bathroom as a unit. And there wasn't it's not a percentage number. It was more because it is our smallest building that provides still a good number of beds, and the type of bed and the type of unit with their own bathroom was what we were looking for.
Thanks. A couple rapid fire topics I would put together is this concept of visitation. Are any of you considering changing your guest policies for the fall? And if so, what does that look like? And then aside from that, is there any process with roommate waivers? Are you allowing folks to say, yes, I really want this roommate, here's the waiver, we totally are gonna be safe and love living together? So guest policy and roommate waivers.
I'll take the guest policy one. We are going to suspend our guests and visitors for the year. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. One, we obviously want to keep the density in our residence halls to a minimum. But we also want to make sure that students are practicing behaviors that are conducive to the social distancing. And that will be tricky. I actually was earlier today met with our director of student conduct, and we were talking about, where do we make modifications to our student code or to our residence hall regulations to outline things like guest visitation, and how in fact are we going to respond to it if it's not being adhered to. The bottom line is we're not going to allow visitors, and that's not just family and friends, that's also student to student. So students wanting to come from one hall to another is also going to be prohibited. And we're also looking at making sure students, even within their room, their single dwelling, that they're not inviting people within the residence hall. We want to avoid students having 10 to 15 people in a residence hall. So we're also looking at how we can address the visitation within the dwelling or the residence hall structure as well.
And I would just like to add on, and we're talking about very similar things to Lisa. The other piece that we're also talking about is we have I will call it a very strong party culture on campus. We allow kegs, and we also have a neighborhood piece where our off-campus policies have to mirror on-campus policy. So I also imagine this is a place where we're going to be looking at DC guidance around how many people can be together in terms of not necessarily, to some extent, the guest piece, but also how does that guest play out with how we allow gatherings on campus, whether they include alcohol or not.
And then roommate waivers. Are there any momentum on roommate waivers, or is that a consideration?
I will just say we haven't talked about roommate waivers. I can just say from our practice, at least at this point, is we were only this summer having people in one person per apartment. And if they requested to live with their friend, we allowed that in a single bedroom. What I don't know is how that will translate if we're requiring single bedroom, if somebody was in a, let's say, a double in one of our traditional residence halls. That would probably be a little bit trickier.
In terms of the guest component, is there any consideration? I know we just talked about, like, we might need to change student code of conduct. Is there any thought to how to hold students accountable if, you know, they violate these guest policies? And I mean, if we look at campus culture, wow, that's going to be a pretty dramatic change for students' interaction.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of things. One, we're going to do everything we can to educate the community and set the expectations for students before they arrive and when they have their first floor meetings. We don't have a final decision, but one of the things that we are looking at and assessing is what's the role of the RA. There are some things that the RA will no longer do, and there's some new things that the RAs may have to do. So the RA may play a greater role in enforcement. We have a community desk that operate 24/7. So a part of our ability to control it to some degree is students won't be able to register guests and visitors when they're coming into each hall. But we'll have to look at the role of the RA and just the community members as a whole. It is going to be a huge adjustment, particularly for our returning students. I think our first year students, we can mold them in a way to set that expectation from the onslaught, and I'm hopeful they will adapt. But we are talking about potentially also looking into, you know, enforcement similar to we would do a violation of our code or a residence hall regulation that a student goes through a formalized process.
Thanks, Lisa. I certainly would be mindful of time. I know we both have panelists and attendees who have things to do at the top of the hour, and hopping from Zoom to Zoom is very taxing. Thank you so much to our panelists for being a part of this. Chris, Steph, Seth, and Lisa, it's been outstanding to get to spend the last hour with you all. Again, we still have one more virtual roundtable this week with our Women in Housing group on Friday. And then our slate next week, we have a space for live-in staff members. That is a session just for live-in staff members on Tuesday. We'll be having our business operations group bring together a view on what housing occupancy might look like in the fall with housing occupancy professionals. We'll be having a session at 3 a.m. Eastern with our Global Perspectives group on Thursday, and then on Thursday afternoon, we'll be putting on a session about training staff next year. So lots of great content coming soon. Thank you all for being a part of this, and I will see you online again soon, I hope. Again, thanks for coming, and have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.